seconds, but a judge in Isleworth has apparently overturned the conviction after deciding that laws only ban the use of mobiles to speak into or communicate through while at the wheel. So technically, he didn't actually break the law. Let's talk to Nick Freeman, criminal defence lawyer specialising in traffic and speeding offences, because he will know precisely what we're talking about here. Nick, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mike.
This is quite an interesting case, isn't it? Because I didn't really know. We've seen only recently the police say they're going to road test, I think, on the A34 maybe, some kind of device which detects whether there is a phone being used in the car. They're going to try and track the data, but they won't really be able to use that to prosecute anybody because, one, they won't know who's got the phone, and two, they won't know what the phone's actually being used for, presumably.
Well, first of all, if they want to find out who's using the phone, what they do is they send out a notice to the registered keeper of that car, and
Right.
he then has a legal obligation to say who was driving, so they get over that hurdle quite easily. The law as it currently stands, the specific law, and these are regulations, prohibits an interactive communication using a mobile phone if it's in your hand, if it's handheld. And so there have been cases in the past where people have been using a phone for other purposes which haven't involved an interactive communication, and that doesn't fall foul of the legislation,
Right.
of this specific legislation. But of course, the prosecution are entitled to charge under a whole raft of other legislation. So, for example, if someone was using a phone hands-free, which we all think is legal, and if that person was driving in an untoward fashion, they could be charged with driving without due care and attention.
Right.
If they were driving very badly, they could be charged with dangerous driving. And if there was an accident as a consequence of that, depending upon the extent of the injuries or fatality, they would be charged with even more serious matters. So the important point really is you shouldn't be using your phone in the car, whether it's hands-free or handheld, irrespective of an interactive communication or not. And the problem is, people think, oh, well, this legislation has been brought in, and as long as I'm not using it for an interactive communication, I'm fine. Well, you're not, because as I've just said, there is a whole host of other legislation that awaits you. And people, unfortunately, think, as long as I'm hands-free, I'm okay.
Yeah.
And the number of times people have been involved in fatal accidents using their phone hands-free, and of course, that use of the phone is a very serious aggravating feature,
Yes.
and people are just unaware of it. And just while we're just dealing with the hands-free and handheld, there is no difference in terms of distraction between the two uses. So the
Right.
government says you're all right hands-free, but you're not hands-held. The level of the distraction is exactly the same, and it's actually equated with the same level as being over the limit for drink driving. So the law is in a real mess.
So what about the use?
Really
'Cause sorry to interrupt, Nick. I was going to ask you, when I was talking about this device, which is a new sort of thing they're firing at you to see whether or not the phone is being used.
Yeah.
We've talked about it on the show, and a lot of people rang in and said, well, what about those people who use their phone as a sat-nav, which a lot of people do? I mean, I've got in cabs, and they're using a phone as a sat-nav. Presumably that would be the same under what you've just described.
Exactly, in the same way that it would be. I mean, if you were using your sat-nav, most cars or many cars now have sat-navs that are part of the car.
Yeah.
There's nothing, and so a sat-nav in a phone, for example, would be in a cradle, presumably.
Yes.
Okay, so you're not holding it in your hand, and there is really no distinction between that and a sat-nav, which is an integral part of the car. You inevitably are going to be distracted, aren't you, by messing around with your sat-nav. It may be that there's congestion, you look on your phone or your sat-nav, and you try and put in another address or looking at the traffic, try and work things out. If at that time you're involved in an accident or your driving is adversely affected, in other words, you swerve in a lane or something like that,
Yeah.
and you're seen by a member of the public, you will be prosecuted. But eating a sandwich, having a drink, these are all, any distraction whilst you're driving has the potential to cause you to be charged with a criminal offence, whether it's under there's a whole raft of legislation that is waiting for you. So we don't want to think we're okay using your phone hands-free in a car. Basically, you are not.
No, but I guess the crux of the matter in this case is that he wasn't involved in an accident. There wasn't any kind of infraction other than the fact that he was doing something which they deemed that he shouldn't be doing, using his phone. So what about this loophole about the fact that, technically speaking, he wasn't using his phone to communicate with anybody, therefore is he in the clear, or can he be?
Well, if he wasn't, and I don't know the facts of this case at all, And I'm not. I think you said in your intro that I was defending him. As far as I'm aware, I'd like to think I'd know I'm not defending him. I don't think my firm is defending him. So I do preface my comments with that observation.
Right.
I don't. If he was using his phone to film, it depends whether that would entail an interactive communication. Would that involve the internet or not? I don't know. What you would need to do is to get an expert who would say that actually the internet is involved or it isn't involved. If it wasn't using the internet, it wouldn't be an interactive communication. He wouldn't fall foul of those specific regulations, and the judge is absolutely right. And if you're using your phone for a legitimate purpose, for example, filming in this way, if that doesn't involve an interactive communication, so long as you're not involved in an accident, and so long as your driving isn't adversely affected, you are all right. But the prosecution could say, and the police and the prosecution often don't charge this offence, which is just not being in such a position as to be in control of the vehicle.
Right.
And you're clearly, whilst you're filming, even if your driving is perfect, you're not in such a position as to be in control of your vehicle because you're doing something that...
No, because one of your hands is not on the wheel, presumably. And also, what's interesting, though, is that these original road safety regulations date back to 1986. They were revised in December 2003. Yep. So they're pretty old-fashioned, these. I mean, is this a case of sort of technology...
They are updated. But what happens is it's really the fault of the police and the prosecution for not charging the right things.
Right.
And, this chap who was filming could have been charged with driving without due care and attention.
Right.
And, I think most people would take the view that the ordinary competent and prudent driver would not be filming whilst he is driving. That is a major distraction.
Yes.
And had he been charged with that, he would be convicted of that offence in all probability.
Yeah.
I don't know the facts, but in all probability. So it's a matter for the Crown or the prosecution to decide which particular legislation they want to prosecute under. If they just do it under the regulations that you've referred to, and it isn't an interactive communication, he will successfully appeal his conviction.
Yeah, and later on somehow this case will be sorted out. I mean, I know that's not particularly unusual, but it says Lady Justice Thirlwall will give judgment on the case at a later date. So, I mean, I don't quite understand how that works in the sense of him having been found guilty, then appealing, having something overturned. So where is he actually now? Is he still waiting to be basically given a verdict?
It sounds. Yeah, so as I understand it, was he acquitted initially or convicted?
Well, he was convicted initially, but then it was overturned after
at the Crown Court.
Yeah,
at the Crown Court. And
yeah.
It sounds then like the prosecution has appealed it on a point of law.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the judgment has been reserved, and the judge. The High Court judge is going to deliver a verdict because obviously it has wide-reading ramifications. So she's obviously going to consider very carefully what she's saying, and then she's going to deliver a verdict, which of course will be a legally binding verdict.
Right. So I'm assuming
whatever she says, she'll lay down guidelines in terms of what you can and what you can't do, and she may widen the net and incorporate other legislation outside the ambit of these specific regulations.
Yes.
I don't know.
And I presume
it's an opportunity for the High Court to clarify the confusion that currently exists.
Right, and presumably
and the spirit of the legislation, because when they drafted this legislation, they didn't actually. They've phrased it in a way which confines themselves to a way which I'm sure they didn't really intend.
No, quite. And presumably it will be precedent-setting for other cases. But this I was hoping to get all the way through this show without mentioning Brexit. But I've now said it because I'm not sure now where. I know that we're still in the European Union, but I mean, where is the highest court in the land now? Is it still in Europe?
Well, yes, at the moment, we're in the status quo and nothing's changed. Nothing changes until the deal's done. So there's no change there. Whether this case works its way up there, I doubt it. Well, who knows? That will be a very expensive exercise. It will take a massive amount of time. And I would have thought that the judgment of the High Court will probably be accepted as the right judgment. I don't think it will be too clever to pursue it beyond that.
Well, I mean,
I'm sure the prosecution wouldn't try and pursue it beyond that.
No, I'm sure. But I mean, just from a legal perspective, and I'm not asking you to give away the sort of secrets of your profession, but I mean, do you think this guy should just have not bothered trying to take this quite as far as he has?
No, I don't know. I think what happened is he was convicted at the magistrate's court.
Yeah.
His lawyers have correctly advised him if it wasn't an interactive communication, and it sounds like it wasn't, to appeal to the Crown Court.
Yeah.
The Crown Court have ruled and said, look, he wasn't guilty. I mean, there was a case a few years ago involving a comedian who recorded a joke.
Yeah.
I was involved in that case, and I argued successfully it wasn't an interactive communication. The prosecution could have charged other offences, and they didn't. That's their fault. And as I said to you earlier, Mike, if the prosecution want to convict, they need to make sure they charge the right offence. And here, if they've charged under these specific regulations and it wasn't an interactive communication, they would have known that right from the start. That's their mistake. It's not the defendant's fault. And the defendant can't be blamed for successfully appealing on a point of law. What's happened now is the prosecution is saying, right, we want to pursue this because we feel it's wrong and we're going to see what the High Court says. And the defendant has no choice about that. All he can do is roll over and say, yes, you're right.
Yes.
And legally, I wouldn't be advising him to. Well, I'm not advising him, so I'm not going to say anything about that.
Okay.
But I don't think you can blame the defendant because it's out of his control if the prosecution want to pursue the appeal on a point of law to the High Court, which is what they're doing.
And one final question for you, Nick. Steve has sent me a tweet saying, my phone is used to help keep my car insurance low as it monitors my driving 24/7. Am I breaking the law? What do you reckon?
No, because as long as it's not in his hand,
right,
he's not breaking the law. As long as it's not providing any distraction, he's fine. There's no problem there at all. The problem comes when you start to mess around with your phone in one way or another, and then you have a distraction, and then you have a potential problem. And the government, in my view, and I've said this for some time, should ban the use of mobile phones full stop in cars. And I know that's very unpopular, but if it's as dangerous as using it on a handheld basis, what is the basis of saying, well, we can use it handheld, hand-free, but we can't use it handheld? It doesn't make any sense, does it? Because what we're concerned with is the level of the distraction and the potential danger. And if they're saying, well, we shouldn't be doing it, unless, of course, that there's an emergency, and there is an emergency provision under the specific regulations that currently exist.
Right. Okay. Fascinating. It's all fascinating stuff. Nick, thanks very much indeed. Nick Freeman, criminal defence lawyer.